Part 1. The Founding Father of Rome, Caesar Augustus. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we begin with a journey way back into the marble and mud streets of ancient Rome. Settle in, dim the lights, and get comfortable. Maybe even stretch out. No need to rush. This isn't a history sprint. It's more of a slow float down the Tiber, listening to stories of emperors who probably had a lot more stress than any of us will ever know. Or maybe less. Who really knows? Our first stop is Gaius Octavius Thurinus, better known to the history books as Caesar Augustus. He's often credited as the founder of the Roman Empire, though he'd probably have preferred a slightly quieter legacy. You see, Augustus wasn't born in a palace with a silver spoon balanced perfectly in his mouth. Not exactly. He was born in 63 BCE to a relatively respectable family, not poor, but certainly not the top tier of Roman aristocracy either. His father died when he was 4, which is tragic, but also conveniently meant young Octavius was free from whatever parental nagging might have interfered with his eventual rise to absolute power. Now, Augustus is often described as calm, deliberate, and, let's be honest, incredibly patient. And by patient, I mean he waited decades while chaos unfolded around him, making sure he could quietly, steadily, eventually emerge as Rome's first emperor. Of course, his patience was coupled with a somewhat uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time. He was, in modern terms, the ultimate opportunist, with a mild obsession for image management. He had a particularly interesting relationship with his great-uncle and adopted father, Julius Caesar. Julius was, as you may recall, assassinated in 44 BCE. Octavius, then only 19 years old, suddenly found himself catapulted into the treacherous waters of Roman politics. Imagine being a teenager and inheriting the chaotic legacy of one of the most famous men in your city, not to mention the very real threats from rival generals and senators who were suddenly very nervous about your existence. Despite his youth, Octavius showed remarkable composure. He immediately adopted the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, basically a mouthful, but it tied him directly to Julius Caesar's enduring legacy. And let's be honest, when your family name is suddenly synonymous with power, it helps. Think of it as the ancient Roman equivalent of inheriting a tech empire at 19, except with more senators plotting your death. Over the next several years, Octavian, as he began to be called, skillfully navigated the chaos of post-Caesar Rome. This period was known as the Liberator's Civil War, but for Octavian, it was less liberating and more opportunistic survival. He faced off against the assassins of Caesar, most notably Brutus and Cassius, and managed to consolidate power with a mixture of military might and political savvy. He had allies like Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus, though these alliances were, in the long run, precarious at best. Mark Antony deserves a special mention here. Antony was famously flamboyant. And by flamboyant, I mean he really liked Cleopatra and, of course, made a public display of it. Octavian, on the other hand, had the patience and the poker face of someone who could sit through endless senatorial meetings without blinking. It's almost comical if you imagine him calmly observing Antony's drama, probably thinking, yep, that's going to end badly for him. And it did. The rivalry culminated in the famous Battle of Actium in 31 BCE, where Octavian decisively defeated Antony and Cleopatra. Rome sighed in relief, and Octavian emerged as the unchallenged master of the Roman world. Now, one might expect someone who conquered Rome to throw wild parties or start building extravagant palaces immediately. Augustus, however, had a slightly different approach. He was obsessed with appearances, morality, and the idea of Rome as a city of virtue. His reforms included everything from reorganizing the military to improving the tax system, but he also had a keen interest in moral legislation, laws about marriage, adultery, and even public behavior. Of course, enforcing these laws was another story. Augustus himself wasn't exactly a moral paragon, but public perception mattered. So he created the image of a leader dedicated to the city's moral health. He was also a bit of a control freak when it came to his family. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, which he founded, was plagued by a curious mixture of inbreeding, forced marriages, and political maneuvering. He was meticulous in arranging marriages that would consolidate power, even if the personal lives of his family members suffered. His daughter Julia, for example, had a rather turbulent life. Augustus married her off multiple times to secure political alliances, but she was reportedly unhappy, scandalous, and prone to affairs. It was a case study of dynastic frustration. Augustus wanted Rome to thrive through moral example, yet his own household resembled a soap opera. Let's pause for a moment and imagine Augustus walking through Rome, the forum bustling with senators, merchants, and street performers. He's calm, deliberate, perhaps a little tired from all the management required to keep an empire from collapsing. People admired him, feared him, and were occasionally annoyed by his obsessive attention to public morality. He would have been the type to glance at a particularly ostentatious toga and think, really? Over the top. Tone it down. Rome isn't a costume party. Augustus also had a keen sense of propaganda. Coins, statues, monuments, all meticulously crafted to present him as Rome's eternal, benevolent leader. The famous Res Gestae Divii Augusti, his account of achievements, is essentially him bragging about his accomplishments, but in a very calm, measured tone. No dramatic shouting, just quiet, firm assertions that yes, he did all this for Rome. It's the ancient version of a LinkedIn profile, only with a touch more divine pretension. And while Augustus projected serenity, he had a personal life marked by quirks and subtleties. He married 3 times, yet never seemed particularly passionate in the modern sense. His relationship with Livia Drusilla, his third wife, is notable for its stability and the political savvy she brought to the marriage. Livia reportedly influenced decisions behind the scenes, though historical accounts are sometimes suspect, painting her either as a cunning manipulator or just a remarkably competent partner. Either way, Augustus seemed content to let her manage certain aspects of domestic and dynastic affairs. One of the more interesting quirks about Augustus was his obsession with longevity. Not for himself necessarily, but for Rome. He worried deeply about succession and stability. Unlike some rulers who might rely solely on personal charisma or brute force, Augustus built systems designed to outlast him. The Senate retained its official status, laws were codified, and the military was professionalized. Rome, in many ways, became a machine designed to run smoothly long after its founder was gone. And perhaps that's the quiet genius of Augustus. He understood that real power wasn't about flashy victories. It was about ensuring the world continued humming along after he left. Augustus's personality, however, wasn't without the occasional hiccup. Some accounts suggest he could be surprisingly petty. He had a habit of being offended by minor slights and could hold grudges for years. It's easy to imagine him quietly fuming while walking past a senator who forgot to bow, or worse, dared to speak in an unflattering tone. But these moments were rare, and overall, Augustus cultivated an image of calm authority. His health, too, was a matter of concern in later years. Augustus was known to suffer from insomnia, digestive issues, and perhaps mild anxiety, though sources are sparse. Modern historians speculate he may have had chronic stress-related ailments, which, given his lifelong immersion in the precarious world of Roman politics, isn't exactly shocking. Still, he remained remarkably functional and present in governance until the very end. And so, as we drift along through Augustus's life, there's a pattern that emerges. Patience, careful calculation, and a relentless focus on appearances and legacy. He managed to transform Rome from a fractious republic into a stable empire, all while quietly managing his family, his allies, and his public image. It's almost meditative if you think about it. Decades of strategic calm, punctuated by occasional family drama, public ceremonies, and subtle propaganda campaigns. Let's float over to another interesting aspect of Augustus's life, his love of architecture and urban planning. Augustus wasn't content with simply ruling. He wanted Rome to look the part of an eternal city. He famously claimed to have found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Temples, forums, roads, aqueducts, he commissioned projects that were both functional and monumental. There's a quiet irony here, though. While Augustus projected strength and permanence, many of his... Part 2. The Julio-Claudian Dynasty, from Tiberius to Nero. All right, friends, let's keep our gentle drift through Roman history flowing. If you're still settling in from our earlier chat with Augustus, take a slow breath, maybe wiggle your toes, and let your mind float back to ancient Rome. This time, we'll wander through the lives of his successors, the so-called Julio-Claudian dynasty. They were a lively bunch, though lively in this context often meant a little tragic, somewhat odd, and occasionally uncomfortably dramatic. We begin with Tiberius, Augustus's stepson and second emperor of Rome. Tiberius Claudius Nero became emperor in 14 CE following Augustus's death, and, well, he wasn't exactly the life of the party. If Augustus was calm, Tiberius was reserved to a point of eeriness. You could almost imagine him wandering the marble halls of Rome muttering about inefficiency and thinking, "Really? You expect me to tolerate this chatter?" Tiberius had a complicated personal life, to put it mildly. He married Augustus's daughter Julia, which again was more of a political convenience than a love story. Julia, as mentioned before, was notorious for her scandals and general disregard for the moral legislation Augustus tried so hard to enforce. She apparently had multiple affairs, because why not double down on weird gestures of power? Now, take that with a pinch of historical skepticism. Ancient writers had a tendency to exaggerate, but even a little exaggeration paints a picture of a ruler with very little filter between impulse and action. Despite his antics, there were moments when Caligula was actually competent, particularly in the early months of his reign. He restored some political structures, provided for the people, and even managed to finance public works. But sadly for Rome, the eccentricities eventually dominated the narrative. And in 41 CE, after a reign of just 4 years, Caligula was assassinated, victim to the very political intrigue that had haunted Augustus and Tiberius, only with slightly more flair. After Caligula's demise, the Senate and the Praetorian Guard installed Claudius as emperor. Claudius, full name Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, was an interesting contrast to both his predecessors. Often underestimated by his family, he had physical disabilities and was considered a bit of a scholarly oddball. Claudius proved to be surprisingly competent and practical. Claudius had a fascination with law, administration, and public works. He expanded the empire, improved Rome's bureaucracy, and even wrote historical works. Yet his personal life was, well, complicated, to say the least. He married 4 times, and his household became a breeding ground for intrigue and scandal. One of his wives, Messalina, was particularly notorious for her infidelities and political scheming.
Claudius, apparently either too trusting or perhaps too distracted by state affairs, tolerated much of her behavior until it became politically untenable, and then, well, Massalina met an unfortunate end. History has a way of being blunt like that. Claudius's final marriage to Agrippina the Younger is equally intriguing. Agrippina was ambitious, politically astute, and determined to see her son Nero succeed Claudius. And in a move that is part cunning, part historical inevitability, she arranged for Claudius to adopt Nero, effectively positioning him as heir. Some sources suggest that Claudius may have been unaware of certain plots surrounding his death, though again, we wade through murky historical waters. Claudius died in 54 CE, leaving Nero on the throne at the tender age of 16. And now we arrive at Nero, probably the most infamous of the Julio-Claudian emperors. Born in 37 CE, Nero's early life was a mix of privilege, careful grooming, and the subtle pressure of political maneuvering. He was ambitious, charming, and artistically inclined, a lover of music, poetry, and theater. Unlike Augustus, Nero leaned more into personal expression, often blending his artistic desires with imperial power. In the early years of his reign, Nero was guided by the philosopher Seneca and the praetorian prefect Burrus. These advisors helped maintain stability and kept young Nero from immediately plunging Rome into chaos. For a few years, Nero actually governed relatively prudently. He reduced taxes, provided aid to cities struck by disasters, and even seemed genuinely invested in Rome's welfare. But as time went on, the weight of power, combined with his personality quirks and family pressures, began to manifest in ways historians find endlessly fascinating. Nero's mother, Agrippina, reportedly sought to dominate him, and their relationship was tense, complicated, and eventually fatal. By 59 CE, Nero had orchestrated Agrippina's death, an act that cemented both his autonomy and his notoriety. Beyond family drama, Nero had a reputation for indulgence and eccentricity. He fancied himself a performer, often appearing on stage to sing and play instruments, much to the discomfort of Rome's elite. Ancient sources describe the public's mixed reactions. Some were charmed, many were horrified, and historians have debated the degree to which Nero's artistic pursuits were genuinely obsessive or exaggerated for effect. Either way, it's difficult to imagine the great halls of Rome echoing with the music of the emperor's lyre while senators shifted awkwardly, glancing at one another, and silently questioning life choices. Nero's later years were marked by political purges, questionable spending, and continued fascination with grandiose artistic projects. He oversaw the construction of the Domus Aurea, a massive, opulent palace complex after much of Rome had burned in the Great Fire of 64 CE. There's debate about his role in the fire itself. Did he really fiddle while Rome burned? Probably not literally, but the story persists because the image of an emperor absorbed in art while a city suffered is poetically irresistible. Ultimately, Nero's reign ended in 68 CE, when rebellion and loss of support forced him to commit suicide at age 30. With his death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty came to an end, and thus closed a chapter of Roman history defined by political brilliance, personal eccentricity, dynastic intrigue, and a somewhat casual relationship with morality and family planning. As we reflect on these emperors, a few patterns emerge. One, Rome's leadership was never short on quirks. Tiberius' brooding and Capri, Caligula's eccentric gestures, Claudius's overlooked administrative household, and Nero's artistic obsessions all reveal that power often magnified the oddities that already existed. 2. Dynastic concerns dominated everything. Marriages, adoptions, and political alliances were orchestrated less for love than for control. And 3. Even amid scandal, intrigue, and occasional absurdity, the empire endured, largely because these rulers combined personality quirks with moments of genuine administrative competence. So as you sink a little deeper into your pillow or chair, picture Rome during these years. Picture Tiberius' brooding, Caligula's whimsical eccentricity, Claudius's careful administrative mind, and Nero's musical performances echoing through marble halls. Imagine the tension between public duty and personal idiosyncrasy, the quiet anxiety that accompanies absolute power, and the strangely relatable struggles of family, ambition, and expectation. History, in this light, becomes less about grand battles or shocking betrayals, and more about human beings, odd, flawed, sometimes brilliant, trying to navigate enormous responsibilities while also dealing with their own peculiarities. And the Julio-Claudians, with all their quirks, serve as a gentle reminder that even the most powerful people in history had moments of discomfort, awkwardness, and relatable human imperfection. And with that, we'll pause here, letting the tales of Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero settle in your mind like soft shadows at dusk. Tomorrow, or whenever your historical journey continues, we can move on to the next wave of rulers, dynastic oddities, and personal quirks that history so gently, and sometimes cruelly, preserves.
Part 3. The Flavians and Other Quirky Emperors, Vespasian to Domitian. All right, friends, if you're still floating gently through the ancient streets of Rome in your mind, let's keep the drift going. We've wandered with Augustus, tiptoed through Tiberius's paranoia, giggled a little at Caligula's eccentricity, and admired Claudius's surprising competence. Now, let's ease into the Flavian dynasty, which begins with Vespasian, a man whose life reminds us that sometimes calm competence and practicality can quietly rule the day, even if your family drama is still a full-blown soap opera. Vespasian, born in 9 CE, was not a man of extravagant whims or dramatic flair. In fact, he was unusually pragmatic for a Roman emperor. He came from a family that wasn't quite aristocratic, but certainly respectable, and his early career focused on military service. By the time Rome was experiencing the chaos of civil war in 69 CE, often called the Year of the Four Emperors, Vespasian had earned a reputation as a steady, reliable general. And reliability in the Roman context can get you a long way, including the throne. Vespasian became emperor after the Civil War settled, and his reign was characterized by moderation, organization, and a quiet focus on practical governance. He stabilized Rome's finances after the reckless spending of previous emperors and initiated public works projects that were useful as well as symbolic. You may have heard of the Colosseum, officially the Flavian Amphitheater. Yes, Vespasian started it. He had a sense of legacy and public image, but in a calm, understated way. He probably wouldn't have been caught fiddling while Rome burned, nor would he have planned elaborate musical performances in the palace. He was, in many ways, refreshingly normal for a Roman emperor. However, Vespasian's personal life had its quirks. He was devoted to his family, which sometimes caused trouble. His son Titus inherited more charisma than patience, which we'll get to in a moment. And another son, Domitian, inherited, well,
let's just say his share of ambition and paranoia. Vespasian's relationship with Domitian was complicated. He recognized his boy's abilities, but also his darker tendencies. Perhaps Vespasian was the kind of father who sighed quietly and thought, "I'll deal with that one later." When Vespasian passed away in 79 CE, Titus ascended to the throne. Titus, born in 39 CE, is remembered for a mixture of charm, popularity, and a certain theatrical flair. Unlike his father, he had a more visible personality and enjoyed public attention. He presided over Rome during some notably turbulent times, including the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE and the fire that ravaged parts of the city. He responded with generosity and efficiency, providing relief and rebuilding efforts. Yet, there's an irony here. While he was widely beloved, he also enjoyed the perks of his position in a way that made him prone to indulgence. Public feasts, games, and personal entertainment often took center stage alongside governance. Titus was also known for his health issues. Sources suggest he suffered from persistent illness, which may have contributed to his early death in 81 CE, just 2 years after becoming emperor. In a way, his brief reign was a gentle reminder that popularity and charm, though valuable, do not guarantee longevity, particularly in the unpredictable world of Roman politics. Next, we float gently toward Domitian, Titus's younger brother, who ruled from 81 to 96 CE. Domitian is fascinating because he combines elements of competence, paranoia, and a rather peculiar obsession with control. He was meticulous in administration, strengthened the economy, and managed military campaigns effectively. But as many historians note, he was intensely sensitive to criticism, and some sources describe him as cruel, vindictive, and perhaps a little insecure. Domitian's obsession with image extended to his family as well. He preferred centralizing power and ensuring his household was loyal, sometimes ruthlessly. He feared plots and conspiracies, which, in the highly charged environment of the Roman court, were not entirely unfounded. The result was a reign that, while administratively effective, carried a certain tension as senators and officials navigated both competence and unpredictability. One interesting quirk about Domitian was his interest in architecture and public appearances. Like Augustus and Vespasian before him, he cared about legacy and the aesthetic of Rome. He restored temples, constructed arches, and even implemented cosmetic improvements to public buildings, partly for practical purposes, partly to reinforce his image. It's easy to imagine him pacing the forum, observing the marble columns and thinking, "Yes, this reflects my vision, but someone better not step out of line." As we drift from the Flavians, it's worth noting a recurring theme. These emperors, despite their personal quirks, be it Domitian's paranoia, Titus's theatricality, or Vespasian's quiet pragmatism, were acutely aware of how history would remember them. Monuments, coins, and public works were tools for shaping perception, a kind of gentle obsession that persists across dynasties. They were very much like Augustus in that regard, though each added their own personality tint to the canvas. Moving on, we can't ignore the emperors who followed the Flavians, particularly in the chaotic transition to the Nerva-Antonine dynasty. There's Nerva, who ruled from 96 to 98 CE. He was old, cautious, and, if we're honest, rather dull in comparison to the colorful personalities we've met so far. But that's the point. Dullness, in some ways, was a survival strategy. Nerva's reign was short, but largely stabilizing, and he adopted Trajan, a man whose reputation for military prowess and effective governance would leave Rome stronger. Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 CE, is remembered as a model emperor, especially for his conquests and public works. He expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent and was generally popular. Yet even here, the mundane details of his personal life remind us of the human side of power. He reportedly had no surviving children, leaving succession to adoption, a pattern that repeats throughout Roman history. Even the most successful rulers had to wrestle with family dynamics, mortality, and the human desire for order amidst chaos. Following Trajan, we have Hadrian, who ruled from 117 to 138 CE. Hadrian is perhaps best remembered for building Hadrian's Wall in Britain, but his personal life is just as interesting. He was intensely private, somewhat introverted, and had a famously close relationship with a young Greek named Antinous, whose untimely death led Hadrian to create a bizarre and slightly eerie cult around him. It's a reminder that even emperors, despite their power and authority, grappled with grief, attachment, and the human urge to memorialize. Hadrian also had a fascination with architecture, Greek culture, and intellectual pursuits. He traveled extensively throughout the empire, personally inspecting provinces and infrastructure. One could almost picture him strolling through provincial towns, notebook in hand, muttering about aqueduct maintenance or column alignment, fully absorbed in his own meticulous world. Unlike Caligula or Nero, Hadrian's eccentricities were quiet, intellectual, and focused on long-term legacy rather than dramatic flair. Next, we drift toward Antoninus Pius, who ruled from 138 to 161 CE. Now, here's an emperor who perfected calm. He was devoted to law, order, and administration, earning a reputation for fairness and stability. His reign was unusually peaceful, and he rarely engaged in dramatic theatrics or military adventurism. In personal life, he was conservative, deeply religious, and loyal to his family. The historian in me notes that his era was considered almost uneventful, which, in the context of Roman history, is actually an extraordinary achievement. A calm, orderly reign is its own kind of legacy, even if it lacks the scandalous charm of Caligula or Nero. Antoninus Pius also raised Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, whose introspective nature and stoic philosophy make him an especially soothing figure for our sleepy historical drift. Marcus ruled jointly with Lucus Verus initially, and his life was marked by intellectual pursuits, family responsibilities, and the constant pressure of empire. Even so, he was thoughtful, reflective, and a deeply philosophical leader. If Tiberius brooded, Marcus meditated. If Caligula performed, Marcus pondered.
Part 4. The Later Emperors. Eccentricity, Tragedy, and Dynastic Oddities. All right, friends, let's take a final gentle drift through the later chapters of Roman imperial history. By now, your mind is comfortably wandering through marble halls, quiet gardens, and bustling forums. So, let's explore a few more rulers whose lives were equal parts peculiar, tragic, and quietly fascinating. This isn't the part for dramatic battles or shocking betrayals. No, we're looking at the subtle, weird, and human side of emperors. Those personal quirks and family dramas that make history oddly soothing in its relatability. Let's start with Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from 180 to 192 CE. Born in 161 CE, Commodus was raised under the tutelage of a famously philosophical father. Imagine being the child of Marcus Aurelius, whose meditations probably doubled as bedtime reading, and trying to find your own identity. Commodus, unsurprisingly, leaned toward the theatrical. He fancied himself a gladiator, often appearing in the arena to fight,
And not just as a symbolic gesture, he actually participated in staged combats, though obviously with considerable safety measures. Still, the image of an emperor swinging a gladius in front of a cheering crowd is a curious mix of absurdity and authority. Commodus also displayed early signs of a penchant for vanity and self-glorification. Coins depicted him as Hercules, adorned with lion skins and club in hand, which is a bold marketing choice. It's easy to imagine him inspecting his own statues and thinking, yes, this captures the essence of me perfectly. A god among men, obviously. Sadly, his reign ended with his assassination in 192 CE, after a series of increasingly bizarre and paranoid acts. Even so, his personality, vain, theatrical, indulgent, reminds us that the human element in history often overshadows political efficiency. From Commodus, let's drift to Elagabalus, a ruler of the Severan dynasty whose reign lasted from 218 to 222 CE. Born in 203 CE in Syria, Elagabalus became emperor at just 14. Imagine the intensity of stepping into imperial shoes at that age. Elagabalus' youth and upbringing contributed to one of the most eccentric reigns in Roman history. He is often remembered for religious experiments, personal extravagance, and behaviors that scandalized the Roman elite. Elagabalus had an obsession with his role as high priest of the sun god Elagal, and he attempted to elevate the deity above traditional Roman gods. He also indulged in elaborate banquets, public spectacles, and reportedly unusual personal relationships. Ancient historians loved to emphasize these eccentricities, though we should remember that much of the reporting was colored by political and moral judgment. Still, it's difficult not to picture Elagabalus strolling through the Palatine Hill in silk robes, arranging ceremonial rituals, and quietly bewildering senators with his deviance from convention. He was assassinated at the tender age of 18, which perhaps spares us from speculating further on what might have happened had he survived longer. Yet, even in those short years, Elagabalus left an imprint as one of Rome's most unusual rulers, blending youthful experimentation, religious fervor, and personal whimsy into the imperial office. Next, we float to Caracalla, another Severan, ruling from 198 to 217 CE, alongside his father, Septimius Severus, and later alone. Caracalla is remembered for a mixture of cruelty, efficiency, and an obsession with appearances, particularly his own. He is credited with granting Roman citizenship to all free inhabitants of the empire, a monumental administrative move, though historians note that it likely had financial motivations as well. Caracalla also had a reputation for paranoia and violent outbursts. He reportedly murdered his brother Geta, consolidating power in a rather direct way. And yet, beneath the brutality, there's a subtle thread of human concern. Caracalla's fear of inadequacy, his obsession with personal glory, and the endless burden of living up to both family legacy and imperial expectations. He was, in essence, a man trying to be more than human, with the occasional misstep that made history blush. As we drift further into late imperial history, we encounter emperors whose personal quirks and tragedies reflect the broader decline of the empire. Consider Maximinus Thrax, ruling from 235 to 238 CE, Notable for his gigantic stature, supposedly over 8 feet tall, and formidable military background, Maximinus was physically imposing, but politically inept in many ways. His reign was marked by constant military campaigns and a disconnect from the senatorial class, who found him, well, terrifying. Yet Maximinus also represents the human side of power, a man shaped by circumstance, physicality, and ambition, trying to assert control over a sprawling empire that was increasingly difficult to manage. Then there's Elagabalus's distant cousin, Alexander Severus, who ruled from 222 to 235 CE. Alexander was known for being more contemplative and philosophically inclined than his predecessors. He attempted administrative reforms, emphasized religious tolerance, and preferred rational discussion over brute force. Yet his reign ended violently, demonstrating that even the most thoughtful, gentle rulers were not immune to the chaotic whims of power. History, it seems, has a soft spot for order and philosophy, but not always the patience to allow it to flourish. Now, beyond Rome, dynastic oddities and personal eccentricities continue in fascinating ways. Throughout Europe's royal houses, inbreeding, forced marriages, and bizarre family dynamics became common, creating both political stability and genetic complications. Consider the Habsburgs, who dominated Europe for centuries with a mix of political genius and physical quirks resulting from generations of intermarriage. The infamous Habsburg jaw, protruding chins, and other hereditary traits serve as reminders that dynastic obsession often comes with unexpected and sometimes tragic human costs. Or take the Bourbon dynasty in France, where kings and queens often led lives filled with intrigue, arranged marriages, and personal eccentricities that shaped both politics and culture. Louis XIV, the Sun King, adored ceremony, symbolism, and theatrical presentation. Imagine him quietly fuming if a courtier's outfit didn't meet exact standards. Or Marie Antoinette, whose personal indulgence and fashion obsession would later be weaponized politically, culminating in her tragic end during the French Revolution. What connects all of these rulers, Roman, Habsburg, Bourbon, and beyond, is the persistent tension between public expectation, dynastic duty, and personal desire. They navigated enormous responsibilities while also indulging in human quirks, vanity, obsession, indulgence, eccentricity, or mild cruelty. History preserves their names, but it's the small details, the habits, the family drama, the occasional absurdity that make their stories quietly compelling. As we close this journey, let's return to the concept of inbreeding and dynastic peculiarities. Royal families often married within a limited pool of acceptable partners to preserve political power and consolidate wealth. This led to some unfortunate genetic consequences, which in turn influenced personalities, health, and even political decision-making. It's both tragic and oddly human.